Welcome to this demo lesson where you're going to create the first EC2 instance as part of this course. Now this lesson will fall under the AWS free tier, so assuming you're using a new account which you created for this course, then you won't have any charges for this lesson. All I'll need you to do is to make sure that you're logged in to the general AWS account and you have the Northern Virginia region selected, which is US-East-1. Now once you're there, we'll need to move to the EC2 console. Now the quickest way to do this, if you haven't been there before, is to click in this search box at the top and type EC2, find the EC2 service, and then click to move to the EC2 console. Once you're there, you'll probably arrive at the dashboard, and the first thing that we're going to need to do is create an SSH key pair. Now the SSH key pair is the way that you're going to access this EC2 instance, and at this point in the course you might not already have one created if this is a brand new AWS account. So to create one, on the menu on the left, just scroll down and under Network and Security, click on Key Pairs. Now when you create a key pair, it's formed of two parts. AWS keep one and you can download the other part. And it's important to understand that you only get the one single opportunity to download your part of a key pair. So when you do download it, make sure you keep it safe. To create a key pair, just go ahead and click on Create Key Pair. You'll need to give it a name, and I'm going to use A4L for mine, so Animals for Life, which is the case study used throughout all of my AWS courses. You can choose any name you like, but for consistency and to make sure that you can follow all of the lessons in this course as I do things, you should probably also put A4L. Now you're able to select the key pair type. The differences between these two are beyond the scope of this lesson. If appropriate for the course that you're studying, I will have a dedicated lesson which explains the differences between these two different types of key pair. Now in terms of the private key file format, so this is the part of the key pair that you download, you have to choose .pem or .ppk. Now if you're using macOS or Linux, then you should always put pem. If you're using a modern version of Windows, then this comes with a version of SSH and you can also choose pem. If you're using an older version of Windows, or you prefer using the PuTTY terminal application, then you should pick PPK. In this case, I'm going to choose pem, so I'm going to make sure that's selected, and then go ahead and click on Create Key Pair. Once you've done that, your browser will tell you that it needs to save the private component of this key pair, so go ahead and save that into your default download location. And then we're going to move back to the dashboard to begin the process of creating our EC2 instance. So we can click on instances to see all of the instances that we have launched, and at this point in the course you shouldn't have any. We're going to change that. We're going to launch our first instance. So go ahead and click on Launch Instances, and this is going to take you to the Launch Instance part of the console. Now depending on when you're doing this, you might see some notifications from AWS about new user interface changes. AWS regularly make changes to the user interface. Where possible, you should always select the new version of the interface. In my case, there's been a relatively recent change to the interface. This is how it currently looks, so I'm going to close down this notification. Now the first thing that you'll need to do is to name the instance, so I'm going to go ahead and call this my first EC2 instance. So my first EC2 instance, and then I'll scroll down, and the first thing you'll be asked to choose is the version of the operating system that this instance will run. Now this uses Amazon Machine Images, so an AMI is the thing that's used to deploy the operating system to an EC2 instance, and there are lots of different types of AMI available. There's Amazon Linux, Ubuntu, Windows, Red Hat, SUSE, macOS, and lots of other different operating systems. For this demo, we're going to keep it simple and just choose Amazon Linux. In this quick start, once you've picked the main type of operating system used by the AMI, then you'll be able to select between different versions of that AMI. We're going to keep this simple. We're going to pick the default, which is Amazon Linux 2, AMI, HVM, and this also has the benefit of being free tier eligible. Make sure you leave all of the defaults, so 64-bit x86, and then we can scroll down. When launching an instance, you're also asked to pick the instance type. If I click in this drop down, there are lots of different sizes and types of instance, and if applicable for the course that you're doing, I'll have a separate lesson which details all of the differences and capabilities of these various different types of EC2 instance. For this demonstration, we're going to keep it simple. I'm going to leave it as the default. In my case, that's t2.micro. In your case, it might be different, but the important thing is to make sure that it's set to one of the free tier eligible instance types to make sure that you have no associated costs. It's also important to understand that the amount of virtual CPU, memory, and other things like networking performance will all be affected by the type and size of the instance that you pick. Now scroll down further still and you'll be prompted to select a key pair to use. We've just created one, so click in this drop down and go ahead and pick the key pair that you previously created. It should be named A4L. This is the key pair that you'll use by default to connect into the EC2 instance, so it's important that you select the correct one. Now next are the network settings for this EC2 instance, and AWS have tried to keep this simple with the Launch Instance Wizard. We can edit more of these values if we want by clicking on Edit, and this will allow us to select the VPC to use, so the Virtual Private Cloud, and by default this is set to use the default VPC within the AWS account. So this is the default VPC that's set up in the same consistent way, which allows the easy launch of EC2 instances so that it can be accessed from the public internet. So we're going to leave this as default. We're going to set it to the default VPC. If you wanted to launch an instance into a custom VPC, which I'll be talking about elsewhere in the course, then you could select it from this list once you've created it. You can also pick a specific subnet to place this EC2 instance into, and this also selects the availability zone. You can think of availability zones at this stage almost like a data center, although in actual fact they can be made up of lots of different data centers, but a subnet is tied to one specific availability zone. So by picking the subnet, you're also picking the availability zone, and again I'll be talking about this in much more detail elsewhere in the course. In this case, to keep this demonstration simple, I'm fine with going ahead and picking no preference for the subnet, which will allow AWS to pick on our behalf. Now EC2 instances have private IPv4 addresses by default. We need it to have a public IPv4 address, and so this option allows you to either enable or disable the auto assign of public IPs. Because we want to access it from the public internet, we need to make sure this is set to enable. And don't worry, all of these settings are things that we're going to be covering in much more detail later in the course. For now though, leave this as enable for auto assign public IP. We also need to configure a security group for this EC2 instance. A security group is like a mini firewall. You'll be learning all about this later in the course, but we need to create a new one for this EC2 instance. So go ahead and name it My First Instance SG, and you can put the same for the description. Now under security group rule, we need to make sure that this EC2 instance can be accessible from your local machine. I'll be covering the security implications of this elsewhere in the course. For now though, we are going to keep it simple and leave the default, which is to allow SSH from anywhere on the internet. Don't be concerned though, because in order to access this instance, to log in and access the instance terminal, you need the key pair. And at this point, only you have access to the SSH key pair. So this is fine. We'll leave this as default. So SSH from source anywhere. So 0.0.0.0/0. This should be default and you can leave it as is. Scrolling down further still, it's here where we can configure storage, and the default amount and type of the storage is defined within the AMI. So the default for this type of EC2 instance using Amazon Linux is an 8 GB GP2 root volume. And again, I'll be covering all of the detail on this later in the course. For now, we're going to leave this as default. Now, there are other types of storage available in AWS. I'll be covering the features and capabilities in dedicated lessons if appropriate elsewhere in the course, but we are going to leave it as the default. Now, if you just go ahead and expand advanced details, this is something that we're going to be using elsewhere in the course. This is where you can set all of the advanced options for your EC2 instances. For now, though, we're not going to use any of this, but this is where you set any advanced configuration information for instances. For now, we'll leave this as is, and we'll just go ahead and launch the EC2 instance. Now, this will take a few moments to begin the creation process. Once it's started, you'll see this success dialog and you can go ahead and click on View All Instances. You might need to click on Refresh. Once you do, you'll see the instance and it will start in a pending state. This can take a few minutes to fully complete the creation process. So you'll see that it's initially in a pending state. You'll see nothing under status check. Over time, you'll see that this will change into a running state, as mine's just done. I'll just keep hitting refresh. Next, under status check, this will change to initializing. So AWS is going to go ahead and make sure that the instance is in a fully working state before it's ready for use. Now, this part of the process can take some time. What we're waiting for is a status check to change away from initializing. Go ahead and pause the video and wait for your status check to change, and then we're good to continue. Okay, so this is the end of part 1 of this lesson. It was getting a little bit on the long side, and so I wanted to add a break. It's an opportunity just to take a rest or grab a coffee. Part 2 will be continuing immediately from the end of part 1. So go ahead, complete the video, and when you're ready, join me in part 2.